Well, most of us have had the opportunity to enjoy some time away from our normal routine and celebrate Thanksgiving the past few days. Since it is a uniquely American holiday, I have wondered, and it'd be interesting to find out how many of us 331 million plus people living in the States would have a clear understanding of Thanksgiving and where our gratitude is supposed to be directed. Some of the historical revisionism that our kids have fallen victim to claim that Thanksgiving started because the Pilgrims gave thanks to the Wampanoag Indians as the settlers survived that first year in Massachusetts with the help of those local tribes. Well, if that's the whole story, then our current celebration is simply a memorial, but it doesn't have any opportunity for really active practicing of giving thanks to our Creator. Yet if you consider our lives as part of a larger spiritual battle, then undermining this particular holiday makes a lot of sense, because giving thanks to God is out of line with the new ideology. Given the cultural changes in word definitions, new truths that are emerging, and the ongoing rewriting of history, literally just days after it happened, it's difficult not to feel like you're going insane. And in response to the transformation that we've been witnessing, particularly in our own country, but beyond that, there's a song that's been growing in popularity. Some versions, I warn you, are more wholesome than others because the emotion behind the lyrics is a combination of anger and heartbreak. The chorus and the song title is "Am I the Only One?" Here tonight, shaking my head and thinking something ain't right. Is it just me? Am I losing my mind? Am I standing on the edge of time? Last week, we looked at the larger picture of statism, the belief that the state is God and must consolidate all power and control over others to bring utopia to earth. Well, this time, I'd like to dig into the minds of those who cannot seem to understand the truth, nor the embodiment of truth, which is Christ. Into the thinking of those who cannot seem to recognize his teaching or his offer of new life. And to do that, I want to enter the book of Romans. In the opening of this letter, Paul uses the word pictures of light and darkness, that which is visible and accessible to us, and that which is hidden and invisible. And if you've been asking yourself, am I the only one? This chapter presents the reality that no, you're not. God does not want us to live without information. And the ability to recognize his greatness is one that has been given to all people he has made, not just to believers, but to all those who are in his image. I believe this chapter offers us some clarity concerning what it is that we're experiencing right now and why it appears that so many people are not thinking clearly. What we'll study in the next 15 verses unfolds in the middle of chapter 1. So come with me to Romans 1:16. For I'm not ashamed of the gospel, because it is God's power for salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew, then to the Greek. For in it God's righteousness is revealed, from faith to faith, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. If the gospel is what exposes the true condition of humanity, then the gospel becomes the searchlight that allows us to see what's really present in the human heart and mind. Without that light, the darkness is so deep that it absorbs and hides everything unholy that is around us and in us. Paul is not telling us here that his generation is more atrocious than in previous times. Nor is he saying that every period of history contains every ugly point that he's going to make as part of that historic era. However, if we do scan the entire human record from the fall of Adam and Eve to the present moment, the fallen condition of humanity becomes clear, very clear in light of the gospel. Let me say it another way. If the gospel is the light that reveals the righteousness of God, according to verse 17, then as that light illuminates the darkness, it becomes clear how sinful all people are compared to a holy God. Without the contrast between dark and light, there's no way to see the distinction. And yet, according to this verse, that capacity to see the difference and differentiate between light and dark comes by trusting in God's Son by faith. It's only through God's revelation, the gospel, that we can recognize who we really are and who he really is. So now we come to Romans 1:18. For the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all godlessness and unrighteousness of people who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. Since what can be known about God is evident among them because God has shown it to them. In verse 17, the thing that was being revealed was the gospel. Now in verse 18, it's the wrath of God. Where is this wrath directed? Against all godlessness and unrighteousness of people who suppress the truth. The wrath of God is one of those terribly misunderstood doctrines, and one where we have a tendency to put selfish human rage into the same box as this important word describing a characteristic of God. Yet God's wrath is not irrational or indiscriminate, as if our Creator were having trouble controlling his temper. That is human wrath, which often has to do with having our pride hurt, and very little to do with our reaction against what is evil. So let me explain. Sin is the opposite of God's very character. It is contrary to his holiness, his justice, and his goodness. Sin is an attack on the majesty of God and a disruption of his created order. Sin is always an assault upon the truth. And so God's wrath is being directed at the ungodless and unrighteousness of people who suppress the truth. Compared to us, the Lord is the only one who clearly sees sin for what it is and how damaging it is, both to his universe and to us as his most precious creation. So wrath is his proper reaction to sin. It is holy hostility toward evil, God reacting in revulsion against sin, his deeply personal abhorrence of evil. When we hear this, it's not uncommon for us to think of some of those big times, like the plagues against Egypt. Noah's Ark is another example of where it was revealed, and yet the wrath of God has not been seen in human history in all of its fullness. The coming wrath at the return of Christ will be on a level all of its own. And while it is true that the message of the cross contains both God's wrath toward sin and mercy toward the sinner, there's something else taking place in Romans 1. This particular letter describes another form of God's wrath, one that is being revealed currently and in his day when he wrote it, in our world, and it works more quietly and more invisibly. It operates not by God's visible intervention, but precisely by his not intervening, by letting men and women go their own way. We'll soon find out more specifically that the wrath being described is an action of God that gives us what we want. We'll also see how more of this plays out in a few verses, but let's look at this a bit more carefully before we go too far. Verse 18 again. For the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all godlessness and unrighteousness of people who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. If you are in a deep cave, if you're into spelunking, I could never survive because I have claustrophobia. We assume that you would bring a flashlight with you. And you would want to turn it on when you get to the darkest parts so that you can see your way out and help others to do the same. Yet those who suppress the truth are actively doing all they can to cover the flashlight so that nothing can be illuminated. They don't want others to see, and many times they don't want to see. It's not just that they do wrong, though they know better. It's that they have made a decision to live for themselves rather than for God and others, therefore deliberately stifling any truth which challenges their self-centeredness. So what is the truth that they're shoving into a box or a cave and refusing to be illuminated? Verse 19 answers that. That which is known by God. Their unrighteousness, they suppress the truth, since what can be known about God is evident among them, because God has shown it to them. There will remain many mysteries about God that we will not know and cannot know, even in eternity. But this refers to what can be known. Certain attributes have been evident in every time period and in every culture throughout history. It is known as general revelation or natural revelation. What can be known about God is evident among them because God has shown it to them. What are they? For his invisible attributes, that is, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen since the creation of the world, being understood through what he has made. As a result, people are without excuse. Now, we have a bit of an oxymoron here. God's invisible qualities have been clearly seen. While God is spirit, at least two attributes are visible and have been since the beginning of time, and everyone can see it. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge. Now, at this point, it's fairly reasonable to raise a question like, what about the people in those remote places that never heard about Jesus Christ? Well, Romans 1 is an excellent place to come back to when you are actually wrestling with that kind of question. And Paul's answer continues to unfold the further we go in this section, but let me offer you one right now. You see, each person is born and grows up enough to experience the world around him. Regardless of where he lives or in what era he was born, he is able to observe the creation around him through all the senses that God gave us. The sun and the moon operate in cycles. Rain makes the crops grow. Animals store food for the winter. And the stars and planets remain in the sky in such steady patterns that you can determine times and dates and seasons by tracking them. So the person who witnesses all of this that has been made is without excuse if he does not come to this conclusion. With all that I see in this creation, there must be a God, divine nature, and God must be powerful, eternal power. The Lord is going to hold every person accountable for this understanding, even if that's the only information they ever receive before they die. Paul, however, builds his case even stronger. For though they knew God, they did not glorify him as God or show thanksgiving. Instead, their thinking became nonsense, and their senseless minds were darkened. Now, we're getting into some pretty deep water here, so stay with me. Those who are never exposed to biblical teaching or the gospel message specifically already have been given some understanding of God. It can be described as natural knowledge or natural awareness. People are aware that they do not know, but they have no understanding of what it exactly is that they do not know. So it's a felt ignorance. In other words, because we humans are living in God's creation, he built into us an awareness. We recognize that we're finite, and yet we long to live more fully, and let's face it, to live forever, and without suffering. We sense that there must be something and someone greater which is beyond us. Verse 21 confirms this awareness. For though they knew God, they did not glorify him as God or show gratitude. Now, this is a limited knowledge given to all humans. It's not enough to establish a personal relationship with God, but it is enough to lead a person to be grateful and show honor to the Creator. The human mind perceives that whatever lies beyond must be the Creator who alone should be worshiped. In fact, in verse 21, we get a piece of evidence that we were created to worship. But when the truth is suppressed, or when the awareness that there must be a God is not pursued, then we will worship something or someone else. We'll get to that part in a moment. What Paul's describing is this built-in human capacity to recognize God through what has been made, to have a sense or an awareness that this Creator exists and deserves some response from me. And yet, instead of having that limited awareness compel us to learn more, we shove that truth into a dark cave and leave it there. I mean, think about this. You consider those people who spend their entire lives in research, the ones who dive into the complexity of a single cell or the ability of the human body to repair itself after an injury, or the astrophysicist who examines the vastness of the universe. When such individuals reject this reasonable conclusion, there must be a God, they become those who suppress the truth. They do not want to deal with the implications of such a confession. And somewhere in their minds, they have said this: if there really is a powerful God that made all of this that I'm researching, then he must have made me too. Therefore, I am responsible to answer to that Creator for my life and my resources. No, I'm not going to do that. The picture that Paul gives us from the first century increasingly characterizes our own time period. We're witnessing the suppression of truth on a different level, and it has manifested itself as certain groups or individuals gain increasing control over the realms of education, science, entertainment, politics, technology, and everything else. For all the good that natural revelation and natural knowledge can offer and do, to initiate in us this desire to know more about the God that we don't know, the evidence through creation cannot save. The message of the cross only comes by special revelation given by God, the Bible. And yet rejecting the simple evidence of creation is enough to condemn someone. For his invisible attributes, that is, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen since the creation of the world, being understood through what has been made. As a result, people are without excuse. Now, if you're starting to think, that doesn't really seem fair, let's keep reading. By the end of this chapter, it would take a very rebellious heart not to recognize yourself in something that's being described here. And that's the point that Paul is making. No one has an excuse. For though they knew God, they did not glorify him as God or show gratitude. Instead, their thinking became nonsense, and their senseless minds were darkened further. This is the first consequence of what happens when what can be known about God is suppressed. The mind becomes even darker. Verse 22, claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images. More literally, the opening of verse 22 says, professing to be wise, they became morons. And verse 23 introduces the first of the dark exchanges that take place in this downward spiral. The first is that they exchanged the glory of God for the glory of images, the Creator for created things. The images resembling mortal man, birds, four-footed animals, and reptiles. Exactly what you find in Genesis 1. Now, I know we don't usually see this kind of thing in our culture, but in places that are polytheistic or practice ancestor worship and animism, the worship of things as spirits, you will see that. And cults, by definition, follow a human Messiah. Yet in their darkened minds, they think that they have made an even exchange. So what's the big deal? And one thing I found terribly disturbing, yet reinforces this particular description, is something that was documented through our first deception study several years ago. Thousands of people, probably tens of thousands, from all walks of life in all parts of the globe have reported contact with aliens, which are, in reality, contact with evil spirits masquerading as extraterrestrials. And the victims of those encounters are known as experiencers. Yet rarely do they become aware that actually they have been demonized and not taken on a spaceship. What's unsettling as you compare Romans 1 with those close encounters is that many times the creatures that the experiencers encounter appear as some form of man, bird, animal, or reptile. In many cases, those beings appear as hybrids, some combination between human and non-human. What's more unsettling is there have been several who have gone through the trauma of that demonization and yet come to this understanding that such encounters were good and right and helpful. And as a result, they embrace the lies from those experiences and begin to honor, give thanks to, and follow the commands of demons, which they believe are alien saviors. They glorify and show gratefulness to God's enemies without knowing. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of God for images. Now, here's one thing. With every successive exchange that takes place, there's a darker consequence. And interestingly enough, there's a clear correlation between idolatry, the worship of created things, and what Paul describes next. Therefore, God gave them over in the cravings of their hearts to impurity, so that their bodies were degraded among themselves. Because people will not acknowledge the God who revealed himself, but exchange God's glory for a counterfeit, the Lord hands them over to their more vile impulses and passions. This is the first instance of God releasing individuals to pursue what they really desire. And did you notice that idolatry and false worldviews are among the first consequences for those who exchange their minds for a darker thinking? Now, in this verse, they're using their bodies for dishonorable things. We're not told what exactly the impurity includes in this particular verse, but when you no longer answer to your Creator, then your body does not have the same value, and neither does somebody else's body. For generations, false gods and false beliefs have led to impurity, where sexual boundaries are shredded, and where human abuse and exploitation of the innocent becomes practiced and celebrated. Therefore, God gave them over in the cravings of their hearts to impurity, so that their bodies were degraded amongst themselves. And you notice a second exchange taking place in verse 25. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshiped and served created things instead of the Creator, who is forever praised. Amen? The second exchange is that they traded in the truth of God for lies, which resulted in a related exchange, trading the worship of God for the worship of created things, as we were just starting to look at with the alien thing. The lie that is embraced incorporate the following ideas: that humans can exist and thrive apart from the Creator, that we should venerate someone or something in place of the true God. That's the core of the lie. And yet this mind exchange also brings a response from God, which goes even darker. For this reason, God gave them over to degrading passions. Now, this is the second time that God delivers them to what they wanted instead of desiring Him. And we'll see in a moment that these passions are more specifically sexual. While these next few verses are seen as hate speech now, they are God's words, not ours. And this dark and downward spiral leads to a third exchange. They exchanged natural relationships for unnatural ones. For this reason, God gave them over to degrading passions, for even their females exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. The males, in the same way, also left their natural relations with females and were inflamed in their lust for one another. Males committed shameless acts with males and received in their own persons the appropriate penalty of their error. This is one text that has been reinterpreted to fit the New World theology. A contemporary explanation of this passage would be that it is referring to what is natural in your own mind, not natural in an objective way. Create your own truth, once again. So liberal theologians tell us that it would be unnatural to engage in male-female intimacy for someone who is drawn to same-sex encounters. Another explanation of the text is that Paul is only condemning sex between men and boys, because adult male to adult male is not a problem in God's eyes, which is a strange way to look at this particular text, since 3 times the word for male is here, and it's the same word. Boys are not mentioned at all. Such interpretations are the opposite of exegesis, where you take from the text. It's called eisegesis, where you put into the text what you want it to have to say for your specific context instead of letting the text speak for itself. And one of the strongest arguments against those interpretations is that the word natural actually means inborn, native, in accordance with one's origin. We actually get the word physical from this Greek word. And what we're told is that people exchanged what was natural, physical, and biological for that which is contrary to nature. The reason this offends God is because, once again, it is against His created order, the order revealed both in nature and specifically in the Bible. I realize, and most of us do, that this is one sin that gains so much focus. Yet as we keep reading, it's only one among many of what happens as people exchange truth for lies repeatedly. Once again, God hands them over as they wanted. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them over to a depraved mind to do what ought not to be done. The phrase in green is a single word that has to do with testing and approving, analyzing. It's the ability to assess accurately and draw a correct conclusion about what it is you're examining. And it's the process you go through to check for authenticity and truth, to identify a fake. Remember that a journey down this dark cave, away from what's clearly revealed about God, leads to the heart being darkened further and further. According to verse 1, we were told, they became futile in their thinking and their foolish hearts were darkened. That's where it began. The heart in the Bible, by the way, is a reference to your whole being, your mind, your will, your entire personhood. Now, in verse 28, we get a description that these people don't think it's worth their time to evaluate and approve of God. So God hands them over to a mind that does not function. Since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them over to a depraved mind, worthless, debased, failing the test, morally reprehensible. Using this term in the financial world would mean that you find a metal slug that's meant to look like a coin, but you discover that there's no silver or gold to give it any value whatsoever, so it's counterfeits. The already fallen mind, because we were born as sinners, which then rejects natural revelation, becomes further damaged, just the way it does when we violate God's natural laws. So consider this. What happens to your mind when you drink too much? What happens when you've gone literally days without proper sleep? What happens when you have some chemical substance in your body through your own will or because you're on medications from some surgery? The answer is you can't think clearly. Your behavior, your actions, you can't make logical choices. You can't accurately assess the world around you. So when your brain goes sideways, so does everything else. It's a cascade effect where a chain reaction begins and takes you to places you did not expect to go. When truth is rejected, in time the ability to recognize and to receive truth is impaired. So what happens as a result? In verse 28, we have a play on words that we don't easily see in the English. So here's my translation to try and capture the irony that Paul is portraying. Since they did not think that God was worth their acknowledgement, God gave them over to a knowledge that was worthless, useless for their own purposes. That is a very serious place to be. Without a mind that functions as it was supposed to, every piece of information or truth that you might gather cannot be filtered properly. They're unable to think and decide correctly about God, His will, and truth, period. And then the more your mind becomes darkened, the less it can be trusted in ethical decisions, unless God intervenes. So what happens when the darkened mind belittles, twists, or rejects what is true about God and His creation? People who've refused to acknowledge God end up with minds that are disqualified from being able to understand and acknowledge the will of God. The result, of course, is that they do things that are not proper. As in verse 121, Paul stresses that people who have turned from God are fundamentally unable to think and decide correctly about God and His will. This tragic incapacity is the explanation for the apparently inexplicable failure of people to comprehend, let alone practice, biblical, ethical principles. This is only my opinion. But the more I've looked at this text over the few years, the more I've had to ask myself, if Romans 1 describes the consequences of rejecting truth for so long, does this text explain why we are seeing an explosion of what is considered mental illness? That scares me, to tell you the truth. Is the inability of people to think clearly the result of this dark exchange where God gave them over to a depraved mind to do what ought not to be done, to do those things which are not proper, and to do what is morally wrong as a lifestyle. Verse 29. They become filled with all kinds of... Now this is where we come across a catalog of vices that happen as a result of those three exchanges. We've seen the sexual one, but that's only one. The depraved mind now seeks self-destruction and chaos. And it's the longest list you're going to find in one place in the New Testament. Since not every term is distinct from the other, there'll be some overlap, no doubt, but there are 21 mentioned in the list. It's starting off with, they are filled with all unrighteousness. So your value system is completely disconnected from consistency or truth. Wickedness. It's more of a deliberate attempt to make the ends justify the means. You'll do whatever you have to fulfill your passions and desires. Greed. This one's fairly obvious. No matter how much you have, you can never have enough. And evil, which is a synonym to wickedness. Full of envy. A prominent and now celebrated vice, is it not? As one people group is pitted against another, and the next sin is a natural outflow of envy. The desire to obtain what somebody else has, which you believe you have more of a right to possess, ends up leading to murder, quarrels, deceit. You can't get what you want in the normal way or wait for it to come to you in God's timing, so you manipulate people and situations to obtain what you want. Malice. You combine malice with deceit, and you not only put things in place to accomplish what you could not obtain honestly, but you set a trap. Then when a person that you want to crush falls into the trap, you have even more excitement to destroy them. They are gossips. Gossip is a popular form of manipulation, actually, because you can just hand off a juicy tidbit of actually truth or error and watch it multiply in somebody else's hands who might be more capable at gossip than you are. Verse 30, they are slanderers. Since gossip and slander are very similar, it's very hard to say how much of a distinction you might make, but here's one that was suggested, that gossips are whisperers behind doors, whereas slander is somebody who stabs you in the back. One's a little bit easier to feel right away. And it's interesting to watch this one particular vice become one of the top weapons in the political arena and in the arsenal for those who have no substance of truth or value to what it is that they're trying to promote for everyone. Slander gets to attack the person's character, looks, voice, mannerisms, career, children, heritage, spouse. And now that slander is fully embraced in our society as a valid option for political warfare, not only should we expect that future debates and future elections get even nastier, but we should not be surprised when this freedom to slander filters down to the local level, where a neighbor feels compelled to report another neighbor for saying or doing something that doesn't fit the current worldview. They're God-haters. I'm not sure how often most of us will run into a God-hater, but when you do, you know it. You don't even have to mention anything about faith or God. But if they know that you believe in Christ, a person like this will find a way to show contempt for God in your conversation, more specifically, a contempt for Jesus himself. Arrogant. Confident in his superior power, wealth, social status, physical strength, intellectual or other ability, and treats his fellow men with contempt. This particular word isn't just an attitude. It has to do with harming people because of your arrogance. There's a physical brawling component to this word. And this is the bread and butter of the elitists. It includes not just the attitude, but describes the actions based on that attitude. The one who believes that he is greater will force his or her will on another by engaging in violence and encouraging others to do so. Proud. This may be more of an attitude, but of course, when your world revolves around you, it's difficult not to have it reveal itself by the next vice that goes along with that. Boastful. All combined, these last three words cover the spectrum of selfish activities, thoughts, and deeds, and words. And number 16 goes one more step. They are inventors of evil. This one is unsettling when you consider it, because such people look for new ways to repackage sinfulness by coming up with options and creative methods to benefit themselves with no concern for the harm and pain it causes somebody else. Now, the final 5 adjectives are all describing traits that are missing. And so we put the word without in front of each one of them in order to paint the picture well. Without obedience. We actually get our word apathy from this term. I don't care, so I don't have to listen to you and I don't have to respect you. Without understanding. This has been used to describe a lack of knowledge, which could be corrected if you're willing to be taught. But the New Testament uses this to describe a lack of using your brain to gain insight. Somebody without understanding is actually the picture of what the proverb calls the fool. The fool is not funny or humorous in the Bible. It's one who does not know what is true and doesn't really want to know. It's compounded ignorance. Their ignorance gets them into trouble, but they will not learn from the trouble. Without trust. This is the one who signs the contract, gets the benefit of the agreement, and then sues to break the agreement when it no longer serves their interest. Such individuals cannot be trusted or counted on because they are unreliable. They are without love. This word for love is one that has to do with family relationships more specifically, and it describes a complete lack of concern for your own family members. This lack of love is what is behind Jesus' promise that brother would turn against sister and father against son, as one family member reports that their relative is a Christian to the local authorities to have them dealt with. We haven't had that yet, but it happens all over the world in third world nations. Number 21, without mercy. You see the pain of someone else? You cause the pain of someone else? None of it bothers your conscience, and none of it moves you to repent. So here's a summary of the last 15 verses we just read. People knew God. They knew the truth of God. They had the knowledge of God, but they did not glorify Him or thank Him. They did not think it was worth to keep a knowledge of God. So they did a mind exchange for something darker. They exchanged the glory of God, the Creator, for the glory of images, created things. They exchanged the truth and worship of God for lies and the worship of created things. They exchanged natural relationships for unnatural ones. So, God gave them over to their sinful desires, to sexual impurity, and to a depraved mind, leading to all forms of antisocial behavior. Yet this descent into the darkness of a broken mind has an unusual twist in verse 32. Although they know full well God's just sentence, that those who practice all these things we just listed deserve to die, they not only do them, they even applaud others who practice them. That is willful disobedience. This has nothing to do with ignorance. God's word confirms the reality that even with all the light that is suppressed and all the knowledge that they toss aside willfully, something still lingers. Some knowledge of God, of right and wrong. Something remains in the human soul even when someone has plunged into the corrupt condition that Paul describes in Romans 1. And here it is. They once knew God. They rejected that knowledge. They lost the ability to reason and make ethical decisions. They have a depraved mind now. And yet, even in that, they still know God's moral law, that rejecting God leads to their own death. Their conscience still tells them that. And yet they continue in darkness and encourage others to do the same. That's pretty twisted. Judeo-Christian theology has a term to describe what we've been reading about and going through today. It is known as total depravity. There's not one facet of our existence that has not been poisoned by sin. This does not mean that the image of God has been eradicated in humans. because it hasn't. This does not mean that we do not see a splash of heaven spill over into our world every once in a while, because we do. Nor does this mean that every person is fully living the worst life they could possibly live in rebellion against God. Many people are not anywhere close to that. The section depicts man as he appears in light of the cross. It's not a description of especially bad men only, that's certainly included, but the innermost truth of all of us, as we are in ourselves. When people insist on this dark exchange, trading what is real for what we decide will be our own reality, we end up inheriting much or most of everything we've studied so far. It's very easy to see Romans 1 increasingly describe our nation and many parts of the Western world. And yet this repeated phrase is terrifying to consider. God gave them over to a depraved mind. After the repeated and deliberate rejection of truth, light, and goodness, it's as if a conversation is taking place between the rebellious heart and the Lord. And it starts with something like, I want this instead of you, God. Is that what you really want? I don't want you. I don't believe in your values. I don't value what you value. I want to make up my own path. This is what you want. I create my own truth. Leave me alone. As you wish. It's not that the world is going insane, but more and more are becoming delusional, unable to discern light from darkness, truth from error without the gospel. And here's the part that shocked me the most when I considered the implication of this text being living out in front of our lives. When a person is caught in this depth of sin and darkness, and you witness a lifestyle that is characterized by any or several of the things that we've listed, consider this unsettling possibility. What you see in that person's life, world, family, may be that you are witnessing the wrath of God being exposed in that life. That is not his first choice. God offers to all of those made in his image insight, not darkness. So consider what it is that you're witnessing, because you are not the only one. I am convinced that there are still many outside the faith who generally recognize right and wrong to some degree. They have not exchanged their minds for ones that will not function. And based on this text, they must be the ones that are still responding to the general revelation that God has given. We know many of them, moral people, trying to live decent lives and keep things together for their families, friends and neighbors who are concerned about the depravity that they see, but they can't make sense of it, and they don't have the proper words to describe it. We need to continue to connect with them, and more specifically, to pray for them. For those who are responding to general revelation, we should keep asking that God would give them a desire to dig deeper, for God to give them a hunger for his special revelation, to hear and appreciate his word. At the very center of every person where the knowledge of God, if it is to have any positive effects, must be embraced, there has settled the darkness, a darkness that only the light of the gospel can penetrate. Even though some will not return from being handed over by God to a depraved mind, the last verse of chapter 1 is not a final conclusion for those who still need Christ. Look at it again. Although they know full well God's just sentence that those who practice such things deserve to die, and they not only do them, but they applaud the practice of others who do them. Do you notice what it says there? Those who practice such things. Practicing. It's called a participle. It means it's an ongoing thing. This is not an individual sin. Whoops, I messed up on that one. It's an exercise of rejecting the truth over and over again, which leads to death. And those that practice such things do not have to continue practicing. The message of the gospel is that there are ongoing opportunities to turn from the darkness, to have the mind changed, to turn away from those behaviors when the story of Christ is presented. And so I'm encouraging you, please keep living and presenting the story. Until a person breathes his last breath, there remains hope. While we cannot alter the course of history or reach every person who exchanged their mind for what they now have as a substitute, delusion, we can pray for others that they would see themselves lost in the darkness and receive the special revelation of God that He has given us. If the gospel is the light that reveals the righteousness of God, then as that light illuminates the darkness, it becomes clear how sinful all people are compared to a holy God. For the gospel, in it, is found a righteousness from God, which is revealed to us. A righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. Father, thank you for giving us this text to help us understand delusion that we see at every corner. While we cannot fully put our own thoughts into the thoughts of those who have lost their way to this extent, you've given us the ability to understand the progression and how it goes from one bad thing to another. And so I thank you, Father, that you've provided for us this special revelation because your word is true. We count on it, we depend on it, we learn about you from it, we learn about ourselves from it, and we look forward to what your Son will perform in us and create us to be as we look forward to that day when you come back. So, Lord, as we keep that picture in mind of the day that your Son will come back in all his glory and make it all right, I pray that you would make that image more and more part of our thought process, the thing that we cling to until we see you again. Amen.